I'll devote my brief remarks to one of the most anti-nationalist ideologies in human history and one of the world's most powerful empires, namely communism and the Soviet Union. And to start, I would note that an awful lot of things that people attribute to nationalism, and that gives nationalism a bad name, actually can be attributed to the more totalitarian empires of the last century. For example, one of the, if not the first concentration camps in Europe was set up by the Bolsheviks in Russia shortly after seizing power. The first use of chemical weapons against civilians occurred, again, the Bolsheviks putting down a nationalist revolt in Russia. And of course, we had made great headway in eliminating slavery from the world, mostly led by nation states. And we saw communism, the Soviet Union, the various other manifestations of Marxism in practice usher in a new form of slavery to the modern world. And just lastly on that, to think that it was Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union who in August 23rd of 1939 with the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, two universalizing empires dedicated to eliminating the nation states, the democratic nation states of Europe, conspired to start World War II. And it's inconceivable without that pact between Hitler and Stalin that World War II could have started when it did and how it did. So on the whole, of course, the 20th century was, Nazi Germany was defeated by a coalition of mostly nation states, but the Soviet Union lived on. And following World War II, they occupied, reneged on their Yalta Agreement and occupied the would-be democratic states of Central and Eastern Europe. And on that, I would just note that the United States, in formulating our captive nations policy that was passed by Congress in 1959, July of 1959, we set forth the principle that we rejected the Soviet Union's domination over those nation states. And in the case of the Baltics, we never formally recognized the diplomatically Soviet authority over those states, and we allowed the Baltic embassies to keep operating in Washington. But that policy was set by Truman. It was reinforced by JFK. And of course, this year we celebrate the 30th year anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall, the collapse of communism in Europe. And I see the time, so just to move forward a bit, it was interesting in the last panel to see this difference in attitude towards the EU between the British and some of the former communist states of Central and Eastern Europe. And Anna Maria can obviously speak to this better than I can, but my understanding is that following the collapse of communism, the nations of Central and Eastern Europe viewed joining NATO, joining the EU, in a way as sort of rejoining the West, so that was symbolically and philosophically important. But it also was a way to secure their independence and their national independence from what was viewed still as a threat from the East, namely Russia. I think it is also true within the EU today, it's very clear, there is a sort of two-tiered EU. The countries of Western Europe has set the political agenda, and the community of nations that many of the Central and Eastern European countries joined has now become a very politically, ideologically focused project where if you are against some of the policies of the EU, you are anti-Europe. So that certainly cannot stand. And some people have pointed out that some of the totalitarian tendencies of the Soviet Union are also present in some of the institutions of Brussels. I'm perhaps not prepared to go quite that far, but I will note a very sad and symbolic thing that happened last year when the People's Republic of China, of course, the world's most powerful empire today, and still a single-party communist state, that within the PRC contains at least 5 nations, and that in referencing the Captive Nations Law from 1959 in the United States, which is still in effect, those countries of Lower Mongolia, the Uyghur territory, Xinjiang, and Tibet, as well as mainland of China, are all considered captive nations as a matter of U.S. policy. But China took the opportunity of the bicentennial of Karl Marx's birth to donate a massive statue of Karl Marx to the city of Trier, Germany. And the EU played a part here, and Mr. Juncker went and gave a speech lauding Marx's contributions to Europe at a celebration, a propaganda event mostly paid for by the Communist Party of China. So if that is to, and of course it's worth mentioning, even though many of you know it, that is a huge insult to those peoples of Central and Eastern Europe for whom that is not a cute thing. It is the equivalent of a celebration of Hitler's intellectual contribution to Europe through Mein Kampf. So if that's the direction the EU is willing to go, if that's what they're going to learn from history, and from one of the most extreme, practical, real-life examples of playing out an empire versus a nation-state like Poland or Hungary or the tiny Baltic states, surely, if we're not going to learn from that, there may not be any hope of learning from history at all. But on that point, just to close out, I will say that even if, or when, Brexit goes forward, you won't be immune from this. Starting in 2014, Ukraine began tearing down statues that had stayed up the previous more than 20 years of Marx and Lenin and Stalin and Engels. Altogether, they tore down in the last few years more than 2,000 statues. One of them, a statue of Friedrich Engels, now sits at the invitation of Manchester on a main square in Manchester. And so I think looking at the polling for both the United States and for the United Kingdom, you have among millennials like myself and younger, those 35 years of age or younger, a lack of education, so we have failed to teach some of the most basic lessons of the last century. And this idea that somehow Marxism, communism, socialism, these are pretty good ideas that have never been implemented correctly. And when you have leading figures, and I will name them, Bernie Sanders in the United States, and Jeremy Corbyn here in the United Kingdom, who when they talk about socialism and democratic socialism, we don't have to ask them what they think. There's a track record of the countries that they chose to align themselves with, the atrocities of which they have refused to condemn, and that's going on in real time today in the case of Venezuela, where you had both Corbyn and Bernie Sanders castigating the United States and our history, while lauding the socialist movement in Venezuela, which has delivered to the world one of the newest captive nations, with an estimated 20,000 Cuban Communist Party of Cuba military and intelligence personnel in Venezuela, supporting the dictatorship of Maduro, denying the democratic aspirations of the Venezuelan people, who've had enough of socialism and would like to take their country back. And you also have now the landing a few weeks ago of some 200 Russian military personnel in Caracas. And so what role the United States played leading the free world in defense of the captive nations of Europe that we can celebrate this year because it turned out well. That same struggle, Marxism, a very anti-nationalist idea, is still alive and well. And those socialist Marxist theorists who are trying to understand where it all went wrong, if you read some of their writing, they don't blame the failures of socialism of the 20th century. They don't even blame it on human nature as much. They blame it on nationalism because it was the national feeling, or what Abraham Lincoln might have called the mystic chords of memory that existed in all of the countries that the Soviet Union sought to impose totalitarian socialism upon, so they couldn't implement their policies in the way that Marx had directed them to do. And so that's one side of nationalism defeating the socialist project. But then, of course, you also had the United States and other hostile nation-state actors who, in their view, caused the Soviet Union and other communist states to go into a defensive, more geopolitical, more state-like behavior. And so if you are to ask those leading Marxist theorists of the 21st century, what we should do, their plan is to erode the power of nation states in the world and to erode the attachment that nation states can have over their citizens. And so all of the same dynamics that played out in the 20th century are alive and well today, and we had better learn from them.